Welcome everyone. Thank you for being with us. My name is Danielle Lund. I use she, her pronouns, and I serve as Associate Director of Digital Engagement at Mount Holyoke's Alumni Association. Happy reunion who are all in attendance for this session. If you're comfortable doing so, please feel free to drop your name and class year and where you're zooming in from into the chat. We would love to see who has joined us for the session today. In collaboration with the Mount Holyoke Dean of Faculty's Office, we're so happy to offer 3 virtual back to class sessions during reunion this year and look forward to offering more opportunities like this during the next academic year. A few basic details before we jump into the class. Again, please note that this session is being recorded and that no other recording is permitted without prior written approval. As you're experiencing, we're in meeting format, so if you prefer not to be viewable or audible, please keep your video and sound off throughout the presentation. Should you wish to adjust your view, the control to do so is in the upper right-hand corner of your Zoom window. I will pin our speaker so that he is in the spotlight for the duration of the class. If you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to drop those in the chat box. I'll be monitoring and we'll do our best to address as many of those as we can throughout and at the close of the presentation. So I'm now so pleased to introduce our presenter, Benjamin Gebra-Medin, Assistant Professor of Sociology at Mount Holyoke, whose scholarly interests focuses on the relationship between universities, academics, and the development of modern states. Professor Gebra-Medin is new to Mount Holyoke this year and is going to share more about himself in the presentation. So welcome, Professor Gebra-Medin. We're so happy to be with you today. I'm going to turn things over to you.
Thank you very much. It's nice to meet all of you virtually. As Danielle generously pointed out, I'm new around here. So this is my first sort of experience with the alumni crowd, and I'm happy to make your acquaintance and look forward to hearing your questions at the end of my presentation. My interpretation of this charge has evolved slightly since I submitted the original description, which focuses on one of what I think of as 3 major lines of teaching and research that I have ongoing at the moment. And so the evolution means that I will now include a little bit of background on all 3 of the major lines of research and teaching that I have underway, and hopefully give you a little window into the classroom as it manifests this year, my first year during the pandemic and virtually. Are we seeing the right thing?
Looks great.
Okay, great. You know, technology is always an odd thing in these times, but I do like to make one little joke at the beginning of important presentations that I give virtually, is that I have a tradition now that I wear shoes for big presentations, right? That's what tells me that I'm like in a real space doing a real, so I have shoes on that you wouldn't otherwise know, but they're real and this is important. So let's get over here. Yeah, I thought I would just take a second to introduce myself, having recently arrived here, so you get a sense of my background and where I'm from and what sort of journey led me here. And it began sort of in New England. I'm a New Englander by birth. I was born and raised in Cambridge, and I spent some time in Cambridge Public Schools, ended up at BB&N, for those of you who are familiar with the region, before attending Dartmouth College. Beyond that, I spent some time in my early 20s and 20s sort of traveling around Africa and the Middle East, working for nonprofits, many of which emanated from the Boston area. I spent quite a bit of time in Tanzania and Kenya, building a network of volunteer organizations that were looking to host American students. And then I spent over 2 years in the Peace Corps in Jordan, where I did the same thing, similar sort of thing with young people there. Since then, I returned and decided to head out to the West Coast for graduate training and postdoctoral studies. I got my PhD in sociology at University of California, Berkeley, and then spent the next 2 years, although my relationship with folks there goes back further, working with a number of Stanford researchers in the Graduate School of Education on much of the work that I'll be sharing today. The West Coast is a little different. I don't know how many of you are joining us from out there, but I got a really a deep dive into sort of Silicon Valley culture, Silicon Valley practice, and what is a new dimension to elite higher education, both in terms of methodological development, but also sort of the culture of science and science production. And that will sort of permeate much of the discussion that I try to share with you today. So let's see. And as promised, I'm going to talk you through the 3 classes that I taught this year. And these 3 classes were all informed by a substantive line of research that's sort of been underway prior to my arrival here. So they represent longstanding interests and sort of exciting topics that relate to my own background in research. I started with a course that I called the New American Elite, which was sort of a social stratification class that uses the tools of sociology to think about not so much poverty or inequality from a deficit perspective, but to think about, use the same tools to think about what it is to occupy a position we understand to be elite in today's world and broader political economy. I then taught a course on schooling in American society, which was a survey of contemporary educational dynamics and issues that was particularly lively during the pandemic with so many of the things we take for granted.
I found this on the web.
Co-presence and sort of residential, experiential classroom experiences sort of removed from the picture. So that was really a lively opportunity. And then I taught a methods course called Text as Data in the Digital Era. And this sort of follows a long line of my interest to think about how technology and computer science and data science are upending traditional academic hierarchies and transforming the way science is produced and sort of the student experience is lived on elite campuses. So that's the teaching that I did this year. And you'll notice the rest of my presentation focuses on a number of lines of research. The first 2 of which are either published or under contract, and the last one, while it's gotten a lot of sort of popular press coverage, is still under review. The first line of research that I'll talk about is historical. And it is culminated in an annual review of sociology article I produced with a collaborator at Stanford, focusing on how to understand the different phases of the evolution of higher education, and to think about that as it anchors the evolution of elite culture over the last 150 years. So we've got these 3 periods that I'll speak a little bit more about in a moment. The second major project, which focuses on the contemporary moment in sort of the ecosystem of education, both primary, secondary, and higher ed, is inspired by a book project that's under contract with the University of Chicago Press that focuses on how elite universities have integrated ascendant computer scientists and computer science practices into their academic hierarchies, therefore changing the fabric of what it is to be on a top campus. And then finally, I'll zoom into the most specific project, which is inspired by the methods I teach in Text as Data in the Digital Era. And it thinks about how we can use modern computational techniques to make qualitative components of a selective application, selective college admissions application, like the essay, amenable to analysis in ways that might help us audit the fairness of higher education admissions, and to think through how the pandemic and related changes might influence admissions decisions and fateful student outcomes. So that's sort of the overview. And in each stage, my ambition is to give you a little bit about my research, how it informed the teaching, and then to show you an example of student work that might give you a window into what's happening, how students manifest these ideas in their own context around issues and topics that matter to them, and in really cool ways that leverage technology and take advantage of some of the challenges that we faced during this pandemic year. And the one thing I will say before I cruise along is that I was shocked at how much of the student experience could be carried forward during the pandemic. Like there were lots of losses, and I would not expect anyone to prefer this against the traditional mode of instruction. But the seminar was alive, and students remained engaged to an amazing degree. And what they did was they produced things that they wouldn't have produced otherwise. They used technology in creative ways to share their ideas, and they found ways to collaborate and build community even under really challenging circumstances. And hopefully I'll give you examples of how that unfolded in my classroom. So I'm a sociologist. I study higher education, and it's not necessarily obvious how the field inspires an inquiry in this topical domain. So I thought I would give you a sense of sort of the theoretical background that brings me to this empirical topic, which I try to model for the students that I teach, always in the beginning of the course with some engagement with primary sources, usually written by sociological thinkers that we consider to be in our canon, be they Marx, Weber, or Durkheim, for those of you who still have sociology notes to dust off from a long, from a recent or distant past. And the wonderful thing about sociology as a discipline, and what excites students in the sort of contemporary moment, is that tools are present to deal with sort of the sort of micro level issues of identity, meaning, and culture that they experience in their daily lives at this kind of pivotal moment in their development. We think about race, gender, and class as lived everyday experiences that are embodied in particular ways. And again, the tools of sociology are present to gain inroads in that direction, if those are the passions that students carry with them. But also we have these sociological thinkers who care deeply about political economy from a complex and multifaceted perspective, where issues of social structure, science, knowledge, and power are all at play in our sort of theoretical analysis. But whether you're dealing with the micro level issues or macro issues, you've got to find a way to define a research program that can be empirically analyzed and has some boundaries so that the analysis can be pursued effectively in some reasonable amount of time. And I'll show you how I do that, right? I have taken an approach that thinks about like what we think of as meso-level theoretical components that blend some of the best of the micro and macro perspectives present in the sociological canon to think about how organizational practice emerges, evolves, and changes. We think about how those that work in my tradition think about how organizations are then unified or connected into fields, how fields of organizations can be overlapping, interdependent, or fully independent. And we think about how practice that is lived through organizations, embedded in fields, can be institutionalized and come to be taken for granted. But all of these things enable us to define what would be ideal research sort of objectives and targets in an empirical sense. And from that, that's where I come to care so deeply about colleges and universities as organizations, right? Because in really profound ways, these things that have shaped our lives, we know intuitively that our identities, the way we make meaning of the world, the way we've made meaning of a career, a legitimate set of priorities and outcomes, much of these things were altered, settled, or consequentially sort of guided during those college years, right? And on the macro side, the effect of college as a lived experience on students, helping them understand, what are the boundaries of the legitimate culture of the community they're coming to be a part of, are really significant. But on the other side, we can realize that colleges and universities have a profound impact on social inequality and social structure. I mean, a college degree is fateful for one's life chances. We know this now more than ever. To go without a college degree is to live in a particularly precarious economic and social position. To gain a college degree enables one a certain status claim and position in society. And to go to a certain kind of college does the same thing. So in all those ways, colleges and universities enable me to take this meso-level theoretical sort of orientation to sociology and to think about it sort of to expand it in both directions. And sort of that's the way I conceive of myself as a sociologist with an interest in higher education and the organizations that are colleges and universities. So that's who I am. And I will say that what I presented here is just a little heuristic, a two-dimensional representation of lots of really complex ideas. Behind this are words from Marx, Weber, and Durkheim, and many other practicing empirical sociologists. And as I said, I have students engage with primary sources in the beginning of all of my courses that harken back to these theoretical sort of well springs of our field. And I ask them to do what I've done here often, which is to draw a map of the theories that they're engaging with that are two-dimensional representations, but rich in their relational information to sort of to hold on to what are otherwise very abstract and can be obtuse ideas. And so the first thing I'd like to do by way of an example is to show you one of the really cool ways that a student took a classical text, which is Class, Status, and Power by Max Weber, and sort of reduced this to a two-dimensional theory map. And this is, if you were to study it for some time, and I do believe this will be available, so you could pause the video on this at some point in the future, you'd see that the relationships presented here are subtle and insightful and really powerful. But what's, for me, one of the things that's even cooler, and I'll just, pardon me for, oh, can I not? Yes, there we go. This is what was submitted. And what is so amazing about it is it's sort of interactive and dynamic, right? So should one want a deeper understanding of how Max Weber thought about status, one could click on it for a primary source sort of reference to the text. Each of these relationships is sort of back-ended with direct textual references in dynamic ways. And this is both a phenomenal representation of this student's learning, at least from my perspective, and a really incredible pedagogical tool that's helped me to explain this stuff to other students. So again, just one of the ways that the challenge has been turned into opportunity during the pandemic with sort of more engagement with technology under the right circumstances. So let's see where we were. Yeah, okay. And I'm happy to take questions along the way. The best way to probably manage those would be to put them in the chat, and then and we'll triage them and see how to fit them in. So as I said, the first course I taught was on the New American Elite. And I was attempting in that course to describe how elite culture has transformed over the past 150 years. And it was historical in its orientation. And I took sort of an early 20th century, late 19th century period as a point of comparison. And then I took the last 20 or 30 years as a point of comparison, and I looked at the sociological literature on the evolution of elite culture in both those periods. And I did so, again, informed by my sort of meso-level sociological theory. I looked at sort of the organizations that anchored culture in these two periods. And at the very heart of that, obviously, are educational organizations. But in historical comparison, sort of we come to realize some really important dimensions of them. This is sort of the summary table from the larger paper, this annual review article that was published a few years ago. And I do not expect you to get too deep into it. I will only say, I'll just try to give you a brief summary of the three phases from at least the sort of political economy perspective. That while we think of higher education and educational organizations as essential for the definition of what we might think of as an elite in America today, these organizations 200 years ago, 150 years ago, were not at the center of elite reproduction, right? If you were an aristocrat, whether of the American variety or of some other variety, it was unlikely that your position and status would be defined by your affiliation with an educational organization, right? The centrality of these organizations to elite culture had to be accomplished. And what's happening in the late 19th century, early 20th century is the banding together of a motley group of things that looked like high schools, but would come to be colleges in which sectors were not differentiated, to understand themselves as part of an educational sequence that in college required the completion of high school, and that high school was a thing that lived between primary school and college. And that norms and expectations about what was sort of institutionalized in these organizational forms were accomplished. So, you know, we have all these small colleges in New England as a quintessential example, which were often started by, in some cases, land speculators to whether it was to explicitly civilize rural areas or to transform regional surroundings affiliated with these land holdings into cosmopolitan centers that might encourage development and growth in those areas, or whether they were affiliated with ethno-religious sort of sects within the early American context. So all of these things gave rise to the presence of, you know, associational organizations that then could be aggregated into the field of higher education as we know it. But these were, until the mid 20th century, fairly marginal players from the life of, you know, from the perspective of an average American who would not be expected to accomplish an advanced degree to join a white collar professional world, or well, how to say this, those who were pursuing advanced degrees to gain access to a white collar profession would have been very few relative to those that were doing other labor across the economy. But with the victorious effort in World War II, massive investment in higher education as channeled through the GI Bill, college came to the masses, right? We had an organizational form that had evolved and articulated itself into elite culture and understood what the boundaries and sort of definitional components of that form were, that was then brought to scale. And it's in this period that educational ideology that embraces sort of the ultimate goal of having everyone experience the treatment of college begins to take form, and that's sort of come even further today. But having expanded education and the expectation that all Americans might in some way gain access to college in the post-World War II era at the height of American economic power, we've made progress in exposing more segments of the population to college, but the bills have gotten a lot bigger. And the political economy of college today is such that the state is not likely to foot the bill. And how risk and cost is distributed in the contemporary era has everything to do with the mediation through markets, right? And this is common across multiple other domains. This is sort of the story of our last 20 or 30 years, but the increased dependence on markets to solve many of these distributional challenges that had once been either expected priorities of the requirements of the state or sort of civic community organizations. So those are the three sort of meta phases that we talk about. We think about them as they're articulated in the political economy, but also in the lived experiences of individuals and individual organizations. Yes.
We did have a question come through. It was for the slide prior to this one. But wanted to raise. So for the theory map, what software was used for that?
That was Adobe InDesign, I believe. And it was produced locally and then published on the web. So I can even share, if you remind me at the end of this, the fun link to the website so you can click through it yourself.
Awesome. And then we had a comment that followed that up. I'm wondering how to move forward from here so that students are encouraged to use the same level of creativity and innovation in their projects, even in face-to-face settings. So not a question, but a comment that relates.
And I think we should pick that thread up back at the end. You'll see that it's certainly that's something I contemplate and care about deeply. So we'll get there. I hope. The one thing I would say about that is as much of this is inevitable. This was an accelerant to trends that were ongoing. I mean, students live in these digital ecosystems now, and having been forced to produce digital representations for much of their work this semester, I think there'll in some ways be no turning back. So, but we can get there.
Awesome.
Thank you. I would just say, so I've given you a sense of sort of the research trajectory that enabled us to at least offer 3 historical periods for the development of higher education. And I would say that, again, we think that colleges and universities and associational organizations, like even private high school, so before college, all of these things are actually essential in the construction and evolution and sort of life of what we think of as an American elite through time. So that is sort of the broad orientation there. And I will now turn to one of another fun window into the world that also depends on really cool digital technology. I'm new around here, as it has been said, and I've come to learn that zines are a thing. I didn't really know that, that these are ways that people represent much of what they're doing, their student activism, their student interest. I had not been sort of exposed to that culture until recently. I don't know how far back it dates, but what I asked students to do was to think about how different elements of Mount Holyoke have changed, thinking about the early 20th century to now, and how they changed to be articulated with certain notions of what it is to be a member of the white collar world or the elite, broadly defined. And my goal with this assignment was to both give them a sense that they were still connected to this place, which many of them longed to physically be in, but could not, as I'm sure is true for many of you. And to also give them a sense that they were being sort of, they were being brought into a very particular culture that is defined by historical time and place, right? By virtue of participating in the rituals and everyday life of an environment like Mount Holyoke. And so the way that they did it was this group focused on the art museum and the evolution of the art museum over time. And they did it in zine form. And they produced, I think it was like a 25-page zine that represented some of the best of the history of the art museum, the evolution of the collection. They sort of define these 2 time periods. thought about how the collection itself has evolved, the educational objectives have evolved, and how all these things are relevant to the cultivation of elite tastes that are defined by certain eras, practices of philanthropy as they connect to elite culture, the changing social dynamics of a group that we think of as, you know, sort of an elite, and what we think of the broad term and theoretical tool that we use here is an understanding of cultural capital, of a sort of culture that that involves knowing the right tastes and practices, which are sort of conform to formal organizations that might value those tastes and practices and allow one to carry with them marks of status and prestige that open doors and create opportunities.
Professor,
So that was, yes.
I think you were just expanding on this a bit, but we've had a couple of questions come through just inquiring on like formal definition of elite and how you would formally define zine as well. So.
Well, zine, certainly I've defined intuitively. It's like an informal magazine that might exist in one issue or many, that is sort of, the aesthetic is a little bit more raw, like not as glossy as one might expect, sort of a guerrilla magazine that wasn't expected to be produced necessarily over time, could be represented by one issue. So one of the cool things that students did here was that they worked with the college archivist and they worked with the folks at the museum, all virtually, of course, and found, you know, troves of zines that had been captured over the years. You know, student organization produced zines that they've archived and collected as representative of cultural context in the moment. How do I think of elite culture? That's a good, or the elite broadly defined. Yeah, I certainly leave the term, I allow the term to be defined in some flexible way because different sociological treatments will focus on different dimensions of this status. There are some in the higher education community that would argue that in contemporary American society, holding a bachelor's degree, a four-year degree, separates one from the rest of society. That would be the most broad concept present here, right? And there, we may not think that that corresponds to a formal definition or more exclusive definition of elite. We may think that captures much of the middle class and even a precarious middle class, you know, as we think of today's political economy. So others would think of, you know, either those with status claims historically, whether that aligned with sort of monetary holdings or not, but a family lineage that connects back to particular organizations, whether that connects to actual alumni status at particular educational institutions, be they the right boarding schools historically or the right colleges under contemporary conditions. Or we do read some literature that defines this purely monetarily, right? Like what is it to be in the 1% of the income distribution in today's world? Who are these people? What makes up that community? What is life like if you're you put yourself in a position, or you find yourself in a position that is increasingly separated from the rest of society based on your position in an economy which is rewarding certain labor at the expense of other labor. So those are all ways that I invite students into the literature on sort of an analysis of the elite and think through ways that they might leverage their own interests and passions to ask and answer questions in that domain.
Thank you.
I think, go ahead.
I was just going to say thank you for expanding there.
You're welcome. And I'll, okay, I will now think about the second element here. And I'll try to move a little bit quickly through the last half of this so we have plenty of time for questions. But the next major project, which is sort of my own major investment of time and intellectual energy over the past almost 10 years now, has to do with the rise of computer science and computational sciences, computational experts across academic hierarchies and within the field of higher education. And the way that I conceive of this is as an outgrowth of much of the literature on higher education in the contemporary moment. And this all corresponds to the survey course on education in American society that I taught, second out of 3 this year. And these are the big trends that I try to get across for students of higher education broadly defined in this moment, right? In higher education in particular. That there are more markets for more things across educational fields and organizations than there have been at any point in our past, right? For better or for worse, sort of these markets are shaping practice, they're shaping priorities, and they're shaping culture and lifestyles among students, faculty, administrators, and sort of the field of higher education and K-12, quite frankly. Much of what's happening today in higher education prioritizes interdisciplinarity, although I'm told that at, this may be a representation of a bias toward research universities where these sorts of things are uncommon, but at liberal arts colleges we're probably more familiar than others with experimenting across disciplines, not expecting undergraduates to be experts, but to be exposed to breadth requirements that are meaningful. Nonetheless, that's a dominant trend in sort of higher education. It's evolved into its recent incarnation. An increase in sort of vocationalism, interest in professional objectives of students, which was not present in what we think of as sort of the sociology of the old elite that I taught in my other course, where vocational outcomes were not an expected priority for maybe half of the class that might have matriculated to a place like Mount Holyoke. Now it is essential to every student that I engage with. We also have with this comes the personalization of risk, right? With the advent of markets and the expectation that students are consumers, for better or for worse, the risk is borne by the student and their family in particular ways that's a product of this contemporary arrangement. We also have an incredible array of experimental providers, some of them wholly deficient in serving their students, as we saw with sort of the for-profit university debacle of the past few, decade and a half, but some really dynamic practices have emerged from that space as well. And there are a lot of providers serving students in different ways. And we have an incredibly diverse student, college-going population, more diverse than it's ever been and likely to become more diverse. And figuring out how to serve those students, who are diverse on many dimensions will be a challenge for higher education, and figuring out how those students experience the treatment of college is a powerful sort of topic for research in the social sciences. And again, that's sort of the overview that I try to give to the set of topics that I try to touch on with my students. And this is all, I take this in a particular sort of direction with my own research. And this emerges from a book project that I mentioned that's under contract with the University of Chicago Press. And the objective of the book project is to understand how the rise of computer scientists within academic hierarchies who have not historically been, prestigious members of academic communities, right? It's a new field with new experts that are applied by nature in their orientation to scientific production. How this interacts with disciplinary hierarchies, which have been relatively, actually amazingly stable throughout the history of modern higher education. And how is this shaping field level hierarchies, the relationships between colleges and universities, right? And in particular, the cases that I look at are Stanford, Harvard, and MIT, right? I look at how a place like Harvard, the quintessential incumbent in the field of higher education, is managing the rise of schools like Stanford and MIT that are that have used their engineering orientation and have used the embrace of early computational technologies and computational experts affiliated with transformations in the economy to change what it is to go to a top college and to do research and to practice scholarship in those contexts. I think these changes are profound and sort of touch elements of our culture that have not really been appreciated. And the way that I do this is that I focus on their strategies during the MOOC movement. This is a terrible acronym that lives with us. There was a while back when these colleges decided that they would support the development of massive courses that could be delivered online to students all around the world for basically free. And it was understood to be transformational in the delivery of higher educational content. And one might be forgiven if they thought that those grand proclamations might have eased our virtual delivery during the pandemic, the pain and suffering that was associated with that, but they didn't, because the claims were rather grandiose and disconnected from reality as educational researchers have understood it for quite some time. They did not appreciate the intimate, human-centered nature of the experience that is a residential college experience. Nonetheless, I look at the dynamics that led to all these large schools that maybe should have known better pursuing these speculative technologies as a product of their competition to be seen as leading the way within these digital spaces, and their desire to be seen as innovators in ways that had not historically defined organizational practice at a place like Harvard. So that's sort of the book project, and that's how it relates to the course. Hopefully you'll have that on your bookshelves within the next year or so. And so one of the things I ask students to do is to interpret all those trends and to find an issue which matters to them and to tell a story with data, right? Part of what I've set as my objective for teaching is to incorporate computational techniques, at least on some level, to introduce students to new ways of representing and manipulating data in a sort of flexible way across all my courses. So one way that I did this was with infographics. They're short poster-like presentations that start with a topic or question and sort of evolve through a set of exhibits that demonstrate answers to those questions. And each of these were infographics produced by students, all of which represented topics that mattered to them, right? So we have one on educational achievement and socioeconomic status that looked at different towns in Virginia and compared them across a number of important dimensions. Talked about this kind of representing the individualization of risk in the context of higher education, the idea of the state of student debt in America, which matters a great deal to students today. We had a Francis Perkins scholar produce an infographic on non-traditional students on campus, which is part of the diversity of our contemporary population. And then, it's my understanding that Mount Holyoke has invested heavily in sort of supporting students with different learning styles. And as such, we had a number of students who were interested in sort of the outcome of special education placement, that as a political field of understanding. And then one on sort of more classical school policy perspective. And what's great here is that they're using primary source data, manipulating it and presenting it in all sorts of compelling ways to tell important sort of stories about about the world and the role of education in it. So that's that's another little window into the world. And then finally, my last little thing here, and I will try to be quick. So I teach a class on text as data and the social sciences, which is a fuzzy concept, and I'm going to try to skip a lot of the technical details and go into one application domain. But what you really need to know is that we all use the internet. The internet is powered by search, and that search is driven by two sets of innovations. One having to do with networks of links, right? All these web pages can be understood as how they relate to one another through link networks. But the other is how text can be understood to be similar or different or related in interesting ways, right? And so much of the innovation that took place that enabled the internet as we know it happened at Stanford, happened at Berkeley, happened in and around Silicon Valley, where researchers thought about how to use computational tools on text to convert it into data that could be quantified and entered into complex modeling systems, some of which powered by artificial intelligence, some of which is sort of, used for traditional statistical modeling. And I teach a course where I think about taking those tools and applying them in the domain of like social science to answer questions that are of historical interest to social scientists. And so a domain of interest for me, as you may have guessed at this point, is selective college admissions, right? This is a fateful moment where status and prestige and opportunity is distributed, right? These are the moment at which gatekeepers decide what merits entry into rarefied educational domains and what necessitates exclusion. And exactly how that happens is rather complex, but historically the SAT, and controversially, the SAT has been at the heart of a college admissions packet. Well, the pandemic has made that a complicated proposition. It's hard to go to a test center, it's hard to take a test. And so it accelerated a long-term trend to move away from the SAT, right? But it wasn't just the pandemic, as I said. Places like Mount Holyoke and University of Chicago had moved toward test blind or test optional policies long before the pandemic. And they did so because there were concerns about equity and fairness. And there were arguments that the SAT was just a test of family income or social class, right? So whether that was because your family could buy extra test preparation services, or whether your educational environment was likely to be more closely aligned with the expectations that would be presented on the test, there were big questions about the close association between family income and the SAT, which led to these test blind policies. Well, in a world where the SAT is not going to be as big a part of college admissions as it has historically been, we may ask what's left in the college application packet and what's the state of play in those extra domains, right? And one of those domains, one of these qualitative domains that we're left with is the college admissions essay, which is a peculiar outcome of holistic review, which is itself an iconic American development. There are very few other countries that do anything like what we do to get into college, where you ask a 17 or an 18-year-old, now older students as well, to represent their whole life in narrative form in a way that gets them an advantage to get into college, right? And why is that so weird? Well, because students live wildly different experiences before college, right? I mean, I've read thousands of these things now. You will have students talk about food insecurity and homelessness, and the next essay you read will be about victory at the regatta on the sailing team, right? Somehow these two things have to be made commensurate and judged in a fateful context to decide who gets in if you have fewer other measures, right? So the question that our team began to wonder about was how much class signal is present in essay context. And so we wondered the correlation between sort of family income and essay context how that SAT, I'm sorry, how that compared to the correlation between family income and the essays themselves, the content in them as quantified by the methods I promised exist, but I won't really get into here. And then sort of while we're at it, if we can quantify the essays, what's the relationship between these essays and the SAT score? And so I assure you we were able to do this. The results have been, published in preprint versions. And what's really interesting, let's just start with the correlation, this R-squared between family income and SAT score. It's found to be significant in the data that we got. And let me say a bit about the data. We got nearly 1 million application essays to the University of California system, right? It's a really cool university system because it has some of the greatest public universities in the world and some very broad access universities as part of it, but everyone has to do the same application. So every year they produce, literally millions of cultural products, are drafted by students. So we took a sample of these, which was 1 million essays. I think it was 2016 was the year that we had them from, and we ran them through computer models. We also had students' SAT scores, so we could look at that. And what we find is that as analyzed through these computational methods, the strength of association between class signals and essay content is actually, which is this 0.161, is actually stronger than this thing we've moved away from, which is the class signal in the SAT score, right? And it turns out that even if we get rid of the SAT score, the essay is actually a pretty darn good proxy for how you might have done on the SAT to begin with, right? The strength of association between the essay content as quantified by our measures and SAT score is pretty darn strong, right? So this is, for us, a fascinating finding, and we've had a lot of fun talking to people about it, and the media outlets on all sides of the spectrum have also found it to be pretty provocative as a finding. Like we had a Wall Street Journal editorial written specifically about this paper and this sort of setup that was then picked up by Fox News. I think the National Review, someone just sent me a little clipping that this was used in. And from one political perspective, these findings are a way to undermine the project to make admissions more fair. And the narrative, at least on one side of the political divide, is to say, well, if you get rid of the SAT and the SAT was a marginally better instrument than the essay, then your effort toward fairness is sort of making it even harder for students who might have been from sort of lower socioeconomic status than otherwise, right? And that's, I don't think, I'm quite sure, not the perspective that myself and my co-authors brought to this paper. And I will say that we did just clear some quotes for a New York Times article in the upshot that'll be on this work, hopefully in the coming days or weeks, that uses these results to think about the question slightly differently and to remind us that if we care about involving students from across the class spectrum, if we care about incorporating more students into higher education, given the opportunities that success in higher education comes with, and we believe and we know that many of those students who are historically excluded have full capacity to succeed and to go on to do great things in these contexts if given the opportunity. We have to take seriously the fact that as a good sociologist, we should hypothesize that class signals will exist across sort of the spectrum of application materials that are submitted. So we don't believe that the answer is to reinsert the SAT and to give up on sort of the objective of fairness and inclusion in higher education, but rather to remind ourselves that as we make progress, new frontiers require more thought. So it's far more time than I thought I would take, but I at least took a few questions along the way, and I'm eager to.
Thank you, Professor Medin. Thank you so much for being with us today and sharing the breadth of your knowledge in this area. I did see several questions come through, so I'll try to raise at least a couple of them. So the first being, how do you believe making two-year Associate of Arts granting institutions accessible to all American students will impact the elite argument?
Well, let me just expand on that or interpret it in my own way here is that, right, the debate about free college at this moment is whether we should, that should be focused on 2 years of free college access at community colleges. Basically, we should make community college free. The particular problem that I think that would be best positioned to solve is that the worst outcomes are for students who try higher education, who are maybe not in the best place to succeed, either because their academic preparation before college was not as strong as it could be, or because they don't have the familial support to guide them through the process, or because they have family commitments that are complicated. When those students go to expensive colleges and do not finish, those are the students we worry about the most, because they leave with debt, having taken on the burden of risk, having interpreted the idea that college is good, even though I'm not sure anyone in my community can tell me how to get the most out of this thing. And now I'm saddled with debt, and I don't have a degree to yield status benefits or economic benefits. And so this would allow students to try and not to try at a low cost, right? So in a sense, that's a really particular solution that it offers. Now, that could be very expensive, and we do that at the expense of solving other potential problems, right? Or lightening the load for students in the middle class who are paying lots of money for college in ways now that they have not in the past. So that's my short answer. So there is a problem to be solved there, and many others that are put aside if we solve that problem.
Thank you. And then we had another couple of questions come through about level of degree. And so summarizing one comment, to our grandparents' high school diploma was enough, for our parents' BA was enough. To our children, is it? In the past, work experience propelled you forward, and now it doesn't seem to be enough. Is this the new trend?
It is a trend, and it is a trend that that is among the most vexing observations that we make, right? That is there an end to educational upskilling? If we put education at the center of sort of status and economic security, how can we have an off-ramp as a society, or are we all going to be looking to get PhDs in a few years? And I will just say that like there's no simple answer to that question, but we think about the macro transformation of our economy that has led us away from union work, basically blue collar industrial jobs that might have supported a family at a middle class position. Without that sector of our economy, we're left with only white collar work as a possibility to accomplish the same things. And you see more and more competition and in rather obscene hierarchical explosion of sort of what it is, like exactly how much you need to get into Harvard, Princeton, or Yale, or Stanford relative to a number of other schools, right? We just have this explosion at the very apex of the field, separating people from other opportunities, which are still incredibly valuable. And to the extent that this is how we distribute status in America, and we are not willing to valorize or find pathways into other economic opportunity that can support a family with dignity and stability over the life course, sort of we're going to be trapped in more and more pressure on this system, which again all goes through selective admissions, which is itself a complicated terrain that does interesting things to inequality.
Thank you. We're coming just up against time here, and there's so many questions. I'll intend to save the chat. We are planning to post this session. I'm going to drop into the chat box the link for the main reunion page, where you can see our upcoming events and where we, again, intending to post the recording of this session. But Professor Gebremedin, I just want to say thank you again. I I want to say thanks to all who are in attendance for this session for your great questions and comments in the chat throughout. Wishing you a happy reunion. And I think that's where we're going to close it out for today.
Thank you all for having me. And may I say, if you have further questions, don't hesitate to drop me a line. But enjoy the reunion.
Thank you so much, everyone. Bye now.